I may have mentioned this once or twice in the past, but I used to work as an expert for a major electronics company that you've definitely heard of. I would help do things like troubleshoot TVs and speakers and soundbars, and I would also help people buy the best product for their needs. The only reason I bring this up is because probably the single most common question that I got when I was going to sell somebody a soundbar was, is it going to do that whole thing where when I'm watching a movie, it will start out really quiet and then get super loud all of a sudden? And honestly, that's kind of a difficult question to answer if you want to be totally honest. So today, I wanted to really spend some time getting some research in and understanding this problem and what causes it and what you can do about it. I'm Ian from Tone Hi-Fi. I make handcrafted speakers right here in the USA. You can check me out at tonehifi.com. I wrote out a lot of thoughts for this video, and then when I went to kind of fine-tune everything and do some research and verify what I assumed, I actually found out a bunch of interesting information, and this is a way more interesting topic than I even initially realized. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was take an Occam's razor approach, which simply means that the simplest explanation is often the best. And in this case, the simplest explanation is really simple. It's dynamic range. What is dynamic range? Well, it simply has to do with the difference between the quietest and loudest parts of a given piece of content. You could take anything from this video to a song to a movie and figure out just how much range there is between the quietest and loudest parts of that content. Music usually has pretty minimal dynamic range. Two big exceptions are jazz and classical. These can have quite a lot of dynamic range, but for the most part, a lot of music sounds pretty consistent. Some things are a little bit louder than others, but it's not a huge difference. And over the years, more recent music has less and less dynamic range, but movies have a ton. This is where I started going down a bit of a rabbit hole, because in my research, I saw that a lot of people were saying that movies often have 25 decibels of dynamic range, which is a lot. But a lot of the sources that I was finding for this was just people talking on forums and saying 25 decibels, no source, and really that's not doing good research. So I really had to dig in and try and find some sort of reputable source for how much dynamic range movies have. And I ended up coming across a really fantastic article by a guy named Mike Thornton, who has 50 years of studio mixing and mastering experience and talks about the dangers of loud sounds, audio levels, and tons of other information. Anyways, he states that there are actual standards in place to have 21 decibels of dynamic range for movies. And that's good enough for me. Putting this in layman's terms, that means that the quietest and loudest parts of a movie are really dramatically different. I can actually show you this a little bit. This is a decibel meter that's going to show you how loud things actually are. And you can see when I'm talking, of course, there's some variations, but I would say the average is around 80 decibels. This is very close to my mouth, so that number is higher. And if I try and really speak up and talk as loud as I can, I would need to try and hit 100 decibels while speaking to try and hit that number. So it's a really, really big difference. I would really have to try and push to get my voice that loud. So with that being said, this has to be the reason why movies start out so quiet and then get super loud, right? Well, not necessarily. Words matter, and the whole time we've been talking about every single sound that occurs in a song or in a movie. And you have to remember that that includes everything from actors speaking on screen to things like footsteps, somebody flipping through the pages of a book, and even a literal atomic bomb going off. So the context matters a lot. I think that a big reason for why this change feels so dramatic is actually because of something else. And it's what we've been talking about the entire time: dialogue. The same article that I mentioned from Mike Thornton earlier also mentions that dialogue in a movie should only be about 6 decibels quieter than those big, loud, impactful moments in a movie. Now, I've talked about decibels and how we measure sound before, and decibels are logarithmic, so 6 decibels increase is arguably about double the volume. But I wouldn't say that 6 decibels is really enough for you to be leaping for your remote and start cranking the volume down all of a sudden because it's just way too loud. I think there's gotta be more to the story than this. So to boil a lot of information down really fast, when you watch a movie with surround sound, there's only one speaker that plays 99% of the dialogue that you're hearing. That means that that speaker is really, really important for being able to understand what characters are saying on screen. Unfortunately, a lot of speakers are kinda bad at this, at least when you're not sitting directly in front of them. And I talked about this in some length in this other video, which I recommend watching after this, but what does this have to do with movies being too loud and too quiet? Well, what do you do when you can't understand what's going on TV? You probably crank up the volume. And if another scene after that is even quieter, you'll probably go ahead and crank up the volume even more. And you may even get most of the way through a movie before that big crazy explosion happens and nearly shatters your eardrums. See, movie directors want certain parts of a movie to be quiet and other parts to be loud because it creates a lot of impact. You want that extra volume to make you feel like you're sitting in the shoes of the character. That's important. But they don't want it to be so much louder that it's literally distracting, uncomfortable, and takes you out of the movie. So if there's a thing that is making you crank up the volume on your speakers so that you can hear dialogue, then I think that has to be part of the reason why these moments sound way too loud to us. Ultimately, I think it's entirely possible that whatever speakers or soundbar that you're using could just not be playing dialogue well, and that could be a root cause of the problem. I pretty much always set my receiver to the same volume level. Some movies are a little bit quieter, a little bit louder than others, so I'll adjust a little bit from there, but I really never have to be constantly going back and forth with the remote control because things are too quiet and too loud. Part of that is because I designed my custom center channel to be really good at playing dialogue. Both of the things that I've just talked about definitely have some impact on the whole too loud, too quiet phenomenon. But as a complete audio geek, I think there has to be at least one more reason why this whole thing happens and why so many people on the internet are annoyed by it. I'm just gonna go ahead and throw an entire field of audio research into a wood chipper to massively oversimplify this. Now, I guarantee that you know what distortion is. You've definitely heard speakers that have been distorted. You've heard guitar amps that are playing with distortion. But distortion isn't always just a super loud, crunchy, sometimes awful sound. Distortion's actually measurable in percentages, and it can be anywhere from completely unnoticeable to absolutely destroying your favorite music. Distortion can also be caused by a bunch of different things, but we'll talk about that in another video. For some complicated and very interesting reasons, distortion actually sounds louder than non-distorted content. If you want to understand why, you can ask this guy or read these research articles, but I'm throwing all of that into the wood chipper to keep this really simple. Okay, so taking a step back, distortion sounds louder. If you take any speaker on earth and play it loud enough, it will start distorting. So it's hard to ignore that if you're cranking up your speakers to understand dialogue and then watching a movie and then all of a sudden they get louder, that they could very likely be running into distortion that is exacerbating this problem. See, a lot of speakers can sound perfectly fine at normal listening volumes, but when you're cranking them up to hear all the details in a movie, overcompensating for poor intelligibility, different accents, or performances that may be hard to understand anyways, and then you ask them to play a full 6 decibels louder than that, a lot of them are going to be really pushing their limits. That means distortion, and that means that the sound may be unpleasantly loud or not very clear. Now, of course, the problem is going to be worse with cheaper speakers, but really any smaller drivers in an audio system are going to be more susceptible to distortion. Especially soundbars are really just packed full of a bunch of small drivers, and adding more doesn't necessarily fix the problem. If you want to really appreciate movies in a true home theater setup, having a true surround setup is absolutely the best way to go. I also made this other video talking in detail about the different types of surround sound and where you can get started, but for today, if sudden bursts of loud sounds are driving you crazy, there are a couple of things that you can check for. Most soundbars and receivers and things like that are going to have what's called a night mode. What this is going to do is reduce the dynamic range, so it's going to make those louder parts quieter, and this should pretty much immediately fix stuff being way too loud. The unfortunate consequence is that because it's reducing dynamic range, it's also going to make the whole movie feel a little bit more flat and it's not going to have as much impact. I think another common issue may actually be if your soundbar or audio system has a subwoofer, it may be in the wrong place or not set up properly, which could exacerbate the issue. But you'll have to wait for my next video for me to talk more about that. I could easily make another whole video about a lot of other reasons why this exists. There's a ton of different things about different director styles and historically how movies used to kind of sound different, and even movie theaters, the way that they set things up can be a little bit jarring. So please let me know if you want to see a follow-up part 2 in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're in the market for a new set of speakers, check out my website at tonehifi.com.